Uh, this lecture, we're going to be looking at the difference between primary and secondary states, and we'll look at some secondary states in Africa and also in the Mediterranean, in southern Europe. Okay, well, this designation by archaeologists in terms of primary and secondary doesn't have anything to do with let's say primary states being better and secondary states being not as good. It just deals with how these states form. So every state we've looked at so far is a primary state. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, the ones in Mesoamerica, South America, China, right? Those are all primary states. And what that means is that they emerge for different reasons, but mainly for things that are internal. Or they emerge a lot of times as the very first states in a region. There are no other states around to influence them. And this is really what we mean by primary. So some civilizations might form because of the need for organization for long distance trade, or maybe they form because of the need for large scale workforce to build irrigation, like we talked about before. Secondary states, though, are different. In a secondary state, secondary states emerge out of contact with a state, right? That is, the way secondary states form is they start out as a tribe or a chiefdom, and during the course of their history, they come in contact with a state society. Out of that contact, these tribes or chiefdoms become more and more complex and more powerful, and eventually they become a state. Right? So secondary states form mainly out of contact with a state early in their history, and that's what makes them states. Most of the time, the contact with a state is in the form of trade. Right? And so what trade does, so let's imagine you have a chiefdom, and this chiefdom is sitting on a natural resource, and a state society, merchants show up to that chiefdom, and they want to trade with those people. And the chiefs suddenly realize that they have this natural resource that, maybe is important locally and that they've gotten wealthy off of already, but now they have this big external market. So suddenly the chiefs acquire more and more wealth through trading this material. Plus, they come in contact with people from a different culture, and they're influenced culturally by the new ideas that are spread. The place where the chief, let's say, lives becomes a larger settlement because people are attracted to move there because it's become more wealthy and there's external trade. And so over time, that village may become a city, a market city. The chief becomes a king, and you have a secondary state. And so we're going to see how this happens in different parts of the world. One important thing to realize is that when these, let's say, chiefdoms come in contact with a state and come in contact with new ideas and new concepts, what they tend to do is to emulate these new ideas, but not imitate them. When we talk about imitation, we're talking about wholesale copying, right? So if you imitate something, you're just copying directly everything about it. But emulation is different. Emulation, you're taking, let's say, the kernel of the new idea, and then you're adapting it to your own culture, and you're creating something new. Right? So for a good example would be something like writing. If you're imitating the writing system or of the culture you come in contact with, you're going to learn their language. You're going to write the same alphabet or hieroglyphs. Everything is going to be direct copy. Right? When you emulate, let's say you're in one of these secondary states and you see writing from another culture, you decide, okay, let's invent our own alphabet for our own language. That's emulation, not imitation, because you're adapting it and you're creating something new. Right? So let's look at a couple of these secondary states in Africa. The first one we're going to look at is down here in the modern day Sudan. And this is right below Egypt. So here's Egypt. Remember, Egypt is a primary state, and Egypt is, an African primary state. So down here, right below Egypt, the civilization of Nubia developed out of contact and trade with Egypt. Then we're also going to look at West Africa, most famously the city of Timbuktu, here in Mali and Ghana. Right? And these states emerged out of trade across the Sahara Desert with Arab countries in northern Africa in the Middle Ages. Right? Then we're going to be looking at East Africa, what's now on the countries of Somalia and Kenya, what's called the Swahili Coast, East African coast. And they developed, as we're going to see, out of trade with Arab Muslim merchants as well, but this was through sea routes. And then we're going to look at Great Zimbabwe in southern Africa, and they developed a little bit differently. All right, when you think of the Sahara, you tend to think of kind of rolling sand dunes. People think of deserts. The images that they create of these rolling sand dunes are usually, the Sahara. The Sahara, as we'll see, was not a block for trade. It was actually a trade route. But let's first look at Nubia. Okay, so during the time of ancient Egypt, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, the ancient Egyptians traded and also had a hostile relationship sometimes with the people to the south, who became known as the Nubians. The Nubians had resources that they didn't have in Egypt, like elephants, and the elephant ivory was an important trade good in the ancient world. And you can see depictions of Nubians in Egyptian art. The Nubians, that's different points in Egyptian history, fought in the Egyptian army. So this is a depiction of Nubian soldiers in the Egyptian army. The Nubians were excellent archers, so you can see they're all carrying their bows. That was one of the things that they were known for. This is another depiction of a Nubian. The scar, or these lines on the forehead, might be scars. Some people think that maybe this was a rite of passage, because they know in some East African tribes, ritual scarification of boys when they become men is an important sort of passage from boyhood to manhood. There's another depiction of a Nubian and some others. Right here they are trading or bringing up trade goods. Gold is another important item you could see them bringing to trade with Egyptians. What you just see with the Nubians, as we said before, is emulation, not imitation. So the Nubians were influenced by Egypt, but they created their own culture. And so you see things in Nubian art that you don't see in Egypt. They also took the Egyptian hieroglyphs, as we're going to see, and wrote their own language with them, so they adapted it. But you'd never see an elephant in Egyptian art. But in Nubia, where the elephant is important, they created images you can see of the elephant. The Nubian civilization existed well into Roman times. So here's a kind of a influence of a Roman-style temple, but it's a Nubian design, right? So you put it side by side with, let's say, a Roman temple from Italy, and you'll see the differences. So they created something new. It's emulation, again, not imitation. The lion-headed god was important in Nubia, more so in Nubia than in ancient Egypt. They also believed, here you can see Amun is usually depicted as a ram. The Nubians believed that they had a much more devout relationship with Amun than even the Egyptians. As we're going to see, this becomes important later on when the Nubians become more and more powerful. So the Nubian chiefs quickly developed into kings, and the Nubian villages developed into cities, and they became a very important and powerful state to the south of Egypt. One of the interesting things about Nubia is that they continued to build pyramids for tombs even after the Egyptians stopped building pyramids. And here you can see again the emulation, not imitation. This is not a replica of an Egyptian pyramid. It's very much steeper and smaller height. It's a Nubian style pyramid, so you can tell the difference. And believe it or not, there are more pyramids in Nubia than there are in Egypt, which is kind of a thing that you wouldn't necessarily expect. There's another Nubian temple. So this is a good example of adapting and emulating the hieroglyphic script, but using it to write the Nubian language. And then later on, they used the Phoenician alphabet to write their language as well. You can see how it is Egyptian influence, but not a copy of Egypt. You can see that also with the artifacts and tombs. Here are some of those Ushabti figures that would come alive and serve someone in the afterlife. And you can see when you look at the features and the style, it's not Egyptian. Here is a sphinx of a very famous Nubian pharaoh named Taharqa. We'll talk a little bit about him. But again, you can see this is not Egyptian. The Egyptians on their crowns would have a cobra and a vulture, which were the symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt. Here you can see two cobras and a different kind of crown. Nubians were known as great archers because the Sudan, where Nubia is located, is very dry like Egypt. You get great preservation of artifacts. So this is actually one of the oldest quivers found by archaeologists to hold the arrows. A whole dynasty of Nubian pharaohs in the 600s BC became so powerful that they conquered Egypt. And so during that time, you have a Nubian dynasty ruling over Egypt and Nubia at the same time. And this is quite remarkable. And you can see that Nubian pharaohs, they're usually depicted with the ram's horns of Amun. Right? So the Nubians conquered Egypt, ruled over Egypt, and one of the most famous pharaohs from this time period is a pharaoh named Taharqa. One of the interesting things about Taharqa is he's actually mentioned by name in the Bible, because when the Nubians were ruling over Egypt in 600 BC, the ancient Assyrians were besieging Jerusalem. And this is from the Book of Kings and also the Book of Isaiah. And the king of Judah, his name was Hezekiah, and his capital, of course, was in Jerusalem, had a diplomatic and military alliance with the Nubian pharaoh. And when Jerusalem was besieged by the Assyrians, Taharqa, the Cushite's an ancient name for Nubian, went out to support Jerusalem. And the Assyrians ended up going back to Mesopotamia, and Jerusalem was the siege was lifted. Right, so very, very sort of interesting. You wouldn't necessarily, not many people know that Nubian pharaohs ruled Egypt for about 100 years, and a lot of people don't know that one of these Nubian pharaohs is actually mentioned specifically in the Bible. Right, so this is one of the early secondary states. In Africa. So remember, in Africa you have primary states, you also have secondary states. As we're going to see, many people today, well, historically, but less so today, but still, people think of Africa as kind of a blank space in terms of history. They don't realize that there are all these powerful kingdoms in ancient times, and in the Middle Ages, that certainly were larger than European states for a long period up until the 1600s. So that's an important thing to realize. We're going to see this especially with West Africa and the Kingdom of Timbuktu, because Timbuktu is just the name of the city evokes so many images in many people's minds as a rich place, a remote place, an important trading area, right? And that's what we see with West Africa. So during sort of the early Middle Ages, the peoples of West Africa were developing into chiefdoms. And some of the trade goods that they were trading with each other in the area were gold, but also salt. Salt was a very important commodity in the ancient world. Salt is necessary for human life. It's not just for preservation, but because we perspire and lose salt, people actually have to ingest salt, or they will die. They will lose electrolytes. So salt was a necessary commodity, and it was something that was valuable. In fact, our word salary comes from the Latin word sal, which means salt, because in ancient Roman times, soldiers were paid in salt. So that's where we get our word salary. And so even before contact with North Africa, the peoples of West Africa were developing into important trading chiefdoms. One site called Gene Geno, archaeologists found a very, very large trading village with goods coming from different parts of West Africa. Again, we said that gold was important. You can see some of the gold that's still found in West Africa today. Right? And here's Gene Geno as it looks today. Well, what happened over time? Over time, the peoples of West Africa were then started to trade via the Sahara with peoples from North Africa, and this is in the Middle Ages. And during the Middle Ages, or what we would call the Middle Ages in Europe, this area was settled by Arab Muslim kingdoms. Right? And so, as a result, the cultures of West Africa became Muslim. But it was emulation and not imitation. They designed mosques that were different from mosques that you see in North Africa. And they also had a more liberal, less conservative version of Islam. Timbuktu, this mosque in Timbuktu, has one of the most important Islamic libraries in the world today. So they became a kingdom, and they became a very, very powerful trading kingdom, and one that became an important seat for Islamic learning. An important king at this time was Mansa Musa. So here's Timbuktu over here. This is an ancient atlas from about the 1300s that shows it's a European atlas, and it shows sort of the world known to the Europeans at that time. But Timbuktu was such an important trading center. It was known throughout Europe as a very rich and wealthy kingdom. And one of the kings of Timbuktu was a man by the name of Mansa Musa, who you see here seated on his throne with some gold. Mansa Musa, many people believe, may have been the wealthiest person in history. If he wasn't the wealthiest, he was definitely one of the wealthiest. And in fact, there's a story about Mansa Musa that when Mansa Musa was going on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, he stopped off in Cairo and used so much gold as tips and gifts and things like that. He was just sort of handing out gold to people because he was so wealthy that the price of gold in Cairo dropped like a lead weight, and the economy of Cairo took 10 years to recover. Right? So just by spending, he completely deflated the price of gold. And kind of sank the Cairo economy, not deliberately. It was unconscious, but just shows how wealthy and powerful this West African king was. Okay, so East Africa is a similar story, but here in East Africa, they were trading with Islamic merchants from Iraq, Mesopotamia, by water, right? So this was a sea trade route, and the people here on the coast, up in the inlands, we're going to learn about Aksum when we have a a presentation, student presentation, people here in the highlands, they could, the agriculture was good and the cattle herding was good, but on the coast, cattle herding was not an option. It was not that great for agriculture. It was good, but not great. And so a lot of the people supplemented through trade, and because it was right on the coast, and the people here had access to these different merchants and trade routes and things like that. And so the Swahili coast became a very cosmopolitan area. And in fact, Swahili culture and Swahili language really symbolizes emulation, cosmopolitanism, cultural influence. Right? For example, Swahili is a native African language called Bantu. Right? Native African language, but written in Arabic characters. So again, it shows that sort of emulation. People knew Arabic on the Swahili coast too, but they wrote their own language with Arabic characters. Also, you had influence of different parts of Africa and Islamic culture sort of merging together on the Swahili coast. They were bringing in elephant ivory and getting goods from different parts of you could say India and Arabia, and so it really was a very cosmopolitan place. Many different cultures rubbing shoulders with each other. Okay, now let's look at Southern Africa. All right, so we've seen secondary states. We've seen how they develop out of trade with another state. So in West Africa, they traded with Islamic merchants in the north. In East Africa, they traded with Islamic merchants by sea. Nubia, they traded with ancient Egypt. Great Zimbabwe, they did not have direct contact with Islamic merchants. They're also developing in the Middle Ages. But Great Zimbabwe is in the hills, and the people there are trading with other Africans on the coast. Those Africans on the coast are then trading with Islamic merchants. So the people of Great Zimbabwe are never trading directly with these Islamic merchants. And as a result, Great Zimbabwe doesn't become a Muslim state. It sort of remains the traditional African religion, which involves animism, beliefs in spirits, and things like that. One of the important resources in Southern Africa was gold, and also, as we're going to see, a soft stone called soapstone, which was used for carving. So here's Great Zimbabwe over here. Great Zimbabwe is located in the modern country of Zimbabwe. In the 1800s, this area was a British colony called Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes. In the 1960s, when this area became independent from England, the people wanted to have a name for the country that reflected native African culture, and they decided to call the country after the most important archaeological site in the area, which was Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe means great house, because the site is composed of these very important enclosures you can see here, where elites lived. When they examine these big, massive walls, what they realize is that this was not built for defense. These were not fortifications. These walls were built to restrict access to these elite-only areas. And also they were built for ritual and ceremonies because it looks like some of these walls are very narrow. You can see a space between this wall and this wall. And that was probably used, this passage was used probably in a ceremony. Now, one of the interesting things they found when archaeologists first started working at Zimbabwe, imagine you're working in Southern Africa. You're digging an archaeological site. You expect to see local pottery from the area. But imagine the archaeologists' surprise when they found ceramic from China, and they found beads from Syria, and they found goods from Persia here at this site in Southern Africa. And what this showed was that Great Zimbabwe was tapped into this very international trade route, right? That they were connected by trade to these other cultures. The chiefs who became the kings of Great Zimbabwe had access to all these exotic goods. Beads like this were used to buy cattle and things like that. So this was a very important source of wealth. These chiefs in Great Zimbabwe became more and more powerful, and they became kings. Now, one of the other interesting things about these trade goods is they're only found in elite areas. So it was not like the Indus. In the Indus, many people had access to trade goods. Elites, non-elites, people in the cities, people in the villages. Not so in Great Zimbabwe. You could sort of understand if this was a source of the chief's wealth who became kings, they wouldn't want everybody to have access to these trade goods. So it was strictly controlled, and only elites could have access to these trade goods. You can see from the monuments at Great Zimbabwe, this is, whenever we think of, large monuments, again, we think of the fact that you had to have some sort of organization here in place, and you had to have a labor force and the ability to organize this labor force. So this is another testament to the complexity of Great Zimbabwe, the fact that you have these massive monuments, these huge monumental walls. And you can see, just the size of some of them. This, again, you see the narrow passage, probably used for ritual. This is an example of the soapstone, a soapstone carving showing a bird here and a crocodile. This is the kind of stone that was also traded from Great Zimbabwe, and it became the symbol on the flag of Zimbabwe. So the country of Zimbabwe, the name comes from the ancient site, and the symbol on the flag comes from the ancient site as well. So this kind of gives you an idea of how in some countries archaeology is very important in terms of the identity of the people today. Right? So the ancient past is still very, very important. Here again, you could see some of these massive monumental walls. So it's a very impressive series of sites. And it emerged around 1000 AD. It collapsed in the late 1400s, early 1500s AD. And just like you guys are looking at with your civilizations, there's been a number of ideas to propose to explain the collapse of Great Zimbabwe. One of the theories involves drought. Some people think that might be a reason, but probably one of the most important reasons to explain the collapse is that the trade, you can see here, the trade between Great Zimbabwe and the coast, well, the trade that was going on at this time, around the late 1400s, shifted northwards. And this area was left out of this trade route. Right? And so, if all of a sudden this trade dried up, and if the kings and the elites of Zimbabwe are not getting these important trade goods anymore, there's less incentive to live in these large sites. They probably had less power, less ability to influence people, less ability to get people to work on large projects and mine gold and things like that. And as a result, the economy essentially collapsed, and the civilization collapsed. So I almost, you could compare it to a place almost like Flint, Michigan, in like the 80s, where the car industry, the auto industry, was one of the main sources of revenue and labor and a big part of the economy. And then when that disappeared very quickly, the whole economy took a hit, and there wasn't necessarily anything that could replace it right away. And you kind of had a little bit of a collapse there. So the same could be said with Great Zimbabwe. External trade routes ending, causing a collapse of Great Zimbabwe. Okay. It's also important to mention that Great Zimbabwe was kind of a source for deliberate misinterpretation by European colonialists and colonial archaeology. So it was actually a female British archaeologist by the name of Thompson who worked at Great Zimbabwe in the beginning, and when she was excavating there, she quickly realized that the people built Great Zimbabwe were the ancestors of the local African people who live there today. She could see connections between the local pottery and things like that. And from the dating, she could tell it was from what we would consider to be in Europe the Middle Ages, or the medieval period. So it's very clear to her that this was a local African settlement. But there are many colonists who had these kind of racist ideas concerning African culture, who believed that there was no way that Africans could have built these monuments. So they came up with all sorts of crazy stories to explain them. And one of the crazy stories they came up with was that it wasn't Native Africans who built Zimbabwe, it was the ancient Phoenicians, and that Great Zimbabwe were the lost mines of King Solomon that are mentioned in the Bible, the land of Ophir. And this myth perpetuated for a number of years, even though all the archaeological evidence negated it. But even the story King Solomon's Mines is kind of based on this myth. And you can see a travel poster from the time, right? The Riddle of Rhodesia, ? And you see sort of a spectral figure and the Native African before the monument. And what the poster is trying to imply is that the people built Zimbabwe are not connected to the local African culture, and that no one knows, ? Who built Rhodesia, the Riddle of Rhodesia, right? It wasn't a riddle. It's very clear that this was an African settlement, right? Okay, so these are the secondary states of Africa. In the next lecture, we're going to look at the secondary states in Europe, and we're going to focus on the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans are one of the cultures that we're also going to hear about with a student presentation. So I will see you soon.